From B Media Production, this is B Podcasting. Engage your audience with podcasts.
Hello and welcome to episode 19 of B Podcasting. I'm Nick Schildberger. This episode is all about using podcasts to engage more closely with an audience you might already have. Sure, you always want to boost your market numbers, but how can podcasts provide a deeper engagement with your fans? We speak with Katie DeFiore on how podcasting is changing the face of journalism, particularly newspapers, which can offer a more in-depth analysis of news. And later, we learn about a new technology allowing audiences to interact with podcast guests. It's called VoiceByte, and expect to hear a lot more about it as they collaborate with big media companies. We hear from its CEO and co-founder, Michael Fenech, shortly. But before all that, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host and podcast aficionado, Chris Ashmore.
Hello, Nick. Look, we're seeing a lot of media companies, particularly newspapers, using podcasts to tell stories in different ways, and we've talked about this in the past. Now, a case in point is Voices of Penn State. It's a podcast produced and hosted by Katie DeFiore for Pennsylvania State University's newspaper, the Daily Collegian. Now, we've got a lot to go through today, so I'll get straight into the interview. Katie and I discuss what's special about podcasting and how newspapers are embracing it as a new way of storytelling. What do you think makes podcasts or audio content in general an attractive form of reporting or storytelling?
Well, I personally love it because this sounds like such a small problem, but when I did print stories, you always have to write down notes during your interviews, and now I don't have to do that. I just hold the microphone and let the recorder do the work. But not having to write notes down actually really allows me to be fully present in the interview and to listen closely to what people are saying so I can ask better questions. And then also I feel like audio storytelling really allows you to give a voice to the people. You actually get to hear that person's voice, which I think just adds a whole nother level to your capability to tell a good story.
Well, in terms of audiences, though, why do you think podcasts are gaining traction with the wider population, and how is it attractive for audiences?
Right, so I wrote a column recently on this topic, why podcasts are gaining traction. The first reason that I outlined in my column why I believe this is happening is that podcasts give you in-depth news when you actually have time for it. People listen to podcasts while they're going on a jog or commuting to work or walking between classes. They're doing things already that take 15 minutes or more anyways, so they have this time to consume an entire podcast episode. This is just incredible for journalists because, as someone who has done a lot of print journalism, you struggle to get someone just to read past the first line of your article. So to be able to hold someone's attention for 40 or 45 minutes or even an hour with some podcasts is amazing and gives so many opportunities for in-depth reporting. And then the second reason that I outlined in my article why podcasts are gaining traction is because people are the focus. A lot of news nowadays, because we're all about doing things fast and being the first news outlet to get information out to the world, they kind of lose that human element. They want to get out the what and the why and the where, and the who is sometimes lost because it's harder to take the time nowadays to really interview someone and understand their perspective. So podcasting, because it's more long form and more interview focused, really adds in that human element that's so important to gaining someone's interest. And then the third reason that I said is that they pull you out from a social media headspace. When you're scrolling through social media, it's almost like you're a zombie. You're doing it mindlessly. You're most likely going to be consuming news at the same time as you're watching a cat video. So you're in a different mindset than what you normally would be when you're consuming news when you're scrolling through social media. So you'll see some headlines and look at some pictures of events taking place near you or around you and not really give it a second thought. But when you're listening to a podcast, you're making a conscious decision to do so, which means you're dedicating your brain to consuming that one story instead of the hundreds or even thousands that you're scrolling through at a time on Twitter or on Facebook.
Well, that article that you wrote was for the newspaper, the Daily Collegian, which is the newspaper for Pennsylvania State University. Is the newspaper using podcasts as a means of storytelling?
Yeah, actually, we just started 2 podcasts this semester. I actually pitched one of them to the editor-in-chief, and now I'm the host and producer of it. It's called Voices of Penn State. I based it off of Humans of New York, which, if you don't know what that is, it's basically a photo blog where this one guy walks the streets of New York City and goes up to random people and asks them for an interview, and then basically asks the people that he walks up to spill their guts to him and tell a life story. And so he takes a picture of them and has hundreds of these people's stories and photos on his blog. So my goal with Voices of Penn State was to kind of do the same thing, only on the Penn State campus and in podcast form. I walk up to random students on campus, ask them about their lives, and try to get them to tell me a story about themselves. And then the other podcast that the Collegian does is a sports podcast that the sports editors started, and that's doing pretty well. I think sports podcasting is a big deal right now.
In terms of other newspapers, here in Australia, some papers are tentatively dipping their toes into podcasting, but in the United States, do you know how newspapers are using podcasting to better engage with their audiences, like what you're doing for the Daily Collegian?
I've seen a lot of news sources start to do this, fairly recently as well. All these news sources know that podcasting is a space that's trending right now, and they know that they need to be in this space in some way, but I don't think any of the news outlets really have a handle on what the most effective way is to use them to their advantage. I've noticed that the New York Times puts a link to that day's podcast at the bottom of their daily email briefing, which I'm subscribed to. I think here they're kind of making an assumption that, and maybe they have analytics to prove this, I don't know, but I think they're assuming that most people are looking at this email on their phones in the morning before going to work, and they're assuming that people have 15 to 20 minutes to go through this briefing email, see the podcast, listen to the 10 or 15 minute long podcast, and then be on their way. But I know that when I look at my daily briefing email, I look at it when I open my laptop in the morning to get quick news about what went on the night before. The point being that the briefing is for quick news, and podcasting is not quick news generally. I think that these news sources need to remember that podcasts aren't equivalent to doing a quick radio news story.
Well, Katie, good luck with Voices of Penn State, and good luck with your journalism, and thank you very much for talking to us.
Yeah, thank you so much for reaching out.
You know, by the time you finish a 3 or 4 year undergraduate degree, online technology changes so much. So she's doing a journalism course. But, at the start of a journo course, or any course, particularly media, the technology has changed so much that you almost have to go back and start it again to incorporate that different media. And podcasting is like that. I mean, how many places are teaching podcasting, let alone teaching it as part of a extended newspaper or journalism course?
But good on Katie just for having a crack herself. I mean, that's the best way to learn, isn't it? Just have a go.
Absolutely. And I think, doing your undergraduate course is one thing, but getting experience, real life experience, is as good as or as important as the formal education. So with Katie, I mean, she's at the forefront of learning about podcasting by doing it herself for the college's own newspaper.
And that's, I guess, more of an amateur podcast, but we're seeing a lot more of the big professional media organisations and newspapers getting into producing their own podcasts. There's been a couple here in Australia. We talked about the big one in the US this year from the LA Times called Dirty John. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Obviously, they've got the expertise in-house to do it in some cases, and they know how to tell a good story.
They do, but it'll take a bit of shuffling to work out themselves how to use a podcast and what kind of genre or way of telling the story. It's interesting times because we're at the very beginning of newspapers using podcasts.
What are the biggest benefits, though, do you think, for newspapers to get into it?
Well, firstly, it's a value add, isn't it? I mean, newspapers are always looking to provide extra benefits to the audience, but it lets audiences engage with the newspaper.
And increasing engagement is a good segue into our next interview, Chris, because there's an app that's going to really help radio stations and podcasters engage more with their fans. I'm sort of calling it the audio version of Twitter, but it's a lot more than that. And you caught up with their CEO, didn't you, Chris?
Well, it's another Australian innovation in the world of podcasting. That's right, Nick. The app's called VoiceByte. It's all about deeper audience engagement, as you say. And CEO Michael Fenech joins us to explain what it's all about. Well, Michael Fenech, in a nutshell, can you explain what is VoiceByte and how was it conceived?
Well, everybody's heard of Uber, I'm sure, and Uber turns your car into a taxi. What VoiceByte does, it turns your smartphone into a media microphone. So it allows podcasters, radio shows, TV shows and live events to be able to engage their audience and put a microphone in their pockets to be able to extract content from them in real time in under 20 seconds to engage them on air. So if you look at the traditional ways that podcasters and radio and TV engage with their audience, they're using Twitter, they're using emails, they're getting people to ring in on an open line and they're put on hold. What VoiceByte does is we put a microphone in the audience's pockets for them to record 15 seconds of audio. They can tag their VoiceByte with their mood. They can share that content with Facebook and Twitter. Then they can broadcast that, and then our media partners can extract that MP3 file, that really emotionally engaging content from the audience, and play that seconds later on the program. What we find is when people do create content for shows, they've invested in that show and they're more likely to download that podcast to listen or obviously watch the TV show or listen to the radio program.
Well, I'm thinking of the ABC's Q&A as perhaps a good example of audience engagement where watching the program people can tweet questions or comments to the panellists, but you're saying that something like this, you can actually ask a question to the host or the panellists and they get to answer in real time. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And if you look at the ABC's Q&A, the in-studio audience have the opportunity to stand up and ask the panel questions. And what VoiceByte does, it brings into play the at-home audience, the mums and dads sitting on the lounge at home who may have a passionate opinion or a question for one of the panellists. At this present point in time, they can't get that engaging, powerful content. VoiceByte can. It's a free smartphone application, iOS and Android. People have that microphone in their pocket, then they can engage, have their say, and the producers of the show can get that content in real time as well as all the audience analytics and download that content and play it on air. And literally, as I've said before, 30 seconds after somebody may have created a piece of content for the show, their content could be played on air and one of the politicians could be literally answering it a minute later.
So not only for live shows, but obviously it has advantages for podcasts where listeners can leave a question and it gets addressed at the next podcast episode. Do you have any examples of podcasts that have used VoiceByte?
Yeah, look, we have many podcasters who are using our end-to-end solution. One in particular is the Sydney Roosters, the NRL team based here in Sydney. And their podcast is Roosters Radio. And they said, look, we want to engage our audience in an innovative way. We love what your product can do. So, cut a long story short, they actually got the head coach of the team to come on the podcast. And what the show did was to reach out to their audience on the show previous as well as social to say, look, we've got the head coach on our next show, download VoiceByte, use the hashtag AskRobbo because his name's Trent Robinson. And the audience downloaded the app, and for the first time, they had this access to the head coach like they've never had before. And they asked some really powerful questions, and those questions were played to the coach, and he was put under the spotlight there, and he had to answer some very, very interesting questions from his fans. So it was a really great way of seeing how the podcast format can change and have more of a talk-back feel, which is what we're most excited about.
Is it costly?
Look, the app is free for the audience to download both on iOS and Android, but to access the content through our dashboard and be able to get access to the raw MP3 file and the different data points that we can provide. We license the dashboard. There's 3 tiers. The first tier for podcasters is $9.99 a month. And then there's a professional tier with a few more functionalities that they can take advantage of. And then we have an enterprise tier, which is basically for your larger broadcasters. They have unlimited seats in the dashboard, unlimited number of hashtags, etc. And that's by negotiation on a case-by-case basis.
Well, it's a great journey, and you've got some real traction just recently. You've completed a significant partnership with iHeartRadio. Firstly, what is iHeartRadio for those who don't know it, and what can you tell us about your collaboration?
So iHeartRadio is actually owned by iHeartMedia, who we did the deal with, and iHeartMedia are the biggest media company in the US. iHeartRadio have 858 radio stations, so essentially their radio stations will be putting the VoiceByte app into the pockets of their audience to engage with their listeners, to get them to create content in real time, and at the same time understand detailed audience analytics such as sentiment data and location data, which our dashboard, which we license to our media partners, can access and provide.
Well, Michael, it sounds exciting, and I wish you all the best. Thanks for talking with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, what a great way to draw in the hardcore fan. It allows a bit of variety in the podcast as well, yeah. It's not just listening to the hosts, Nick, and the guests, but also people can ring in. It brings a bit of variety.
Yeah, well, talkback radio has worked forever on radio, so it makes sense for people to be able to engage and to speak into your phone in less than 15 seconds. To send in an audio grab or a question to a podcaster is fantastic.
That's right. It would help with larger members or larger audience numbers, of course, to provide the analytics at least, but also to provide a range of different opinions when they phone in. But I suppose any podcast could do it.
Yeah, and once you've got people using VoiceByte, you're going to have obviously questions which you can answer, which is driving the content in the direction that your audience want, which is really obviously what you're trying to achieve. And for brands and businesses to be able to have their customers or even non-customers to ask questions and talk to the people behind the brand. It's all about, again, we've talked about it before, but making your brand more humanized. And so being able to have that conversation, again, will help do that. And don't forget the analytics part too, which is really powerful because like with Twitter, you don't know where people are tweeting from. In Apple Podcasts, when you leave a review, you don't know who they are apart from their username. You can't even respond. Whereas here, you obviously can respond in audio version. And with the analytics, you know where your audience is based, and obviously some other analytics as well. So I think that's all really powerful stuff and valuable stuff for podcasters.
It is. And, it's exciting what's going to happen with podcasting in the next 12 months. And as we're coming towards the end of 2017, probably a good time to tell our listeners that next episode, we have a special episode. We're putting together the best ofs, I suppose, for the year. And that will be our last episode for 2017. And we'll have a bit of a break and we'll be back with even bigger and better episodes, big call there, for 2018.
Indeed. I look forward to it. Well, that's it for episode 19 of Be Podcasting. So that you don't miss out on future episodes, why not subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, Overcast, or wherever good podcasts are found. And if you found this valuable, we'd really appreciate you leaving us a review and sharing this podcast with others. For more about us, you can go to be.com.au. From all of us at Be Media Production, thanks so much for listening.
Be Podcasting is produced by the team at Be Media Production. Managing Director Nick Schildberger, Executive Producer Heather Dawson, Producer Chris Ashmore, and I'm Peter Letts, Director of Audio. For more about us, go to be.com.au.